What is up, my friends? I know you're super excited. I'm super excited to be doing something different on this channel and unboxing the brand new 2021 MacBook Pro line. It's the 14-inch base model that I purchased with the M1 Pro chip. So before we do get into it, a quick disclaimer that this is an amateur unboxing video. Therefore, I'm going to be speaking of my first impressions from a minimal computer knowledge point of view. But because I love all my 5 subscribers equally, I will also talk about the computer specs most relevant for us students, whether it is note-taking, Netflix streaming, basic gaming, I'll talk about that in a second, programming, or even video editing like I would myself. And then I'll also do a comparison between the 13-inch model, which was released in 2020, as well as this model right here, the 14-inch, and then the 16-inch model, which came with the new generation of the 14-inch MacBook Pros. So, with that said, let's get into it. You're welcome for that. First impression time, this weight is quite heavy. It's heavier than I expected. I used to have the 2015 15-inch MacBook Pro, and that was obviously larger than this, and that was 4.5 pounds. This is 3.5 pounds, so it is a pound lighter, but it is also basically half a pound heavier than the 2020 MacBook Pro 13-inch. So if you're used to that version, then this would be just slightly heavier, but I'm sure you can live with that. Another thing that I've noticed, obviously, is the design of the bezels. So you can notice that the bezels are way more square. Just the overall design of the MacBook, it's really reminiscent of way back, like previous generations of MacBook Pros. And also a lot of people were saying that they're trying to make different products along the Apple line more uniform in terms of design. And we can tell with the iPhone 13, those bezels were much more square as well. So I think a lot of it has to do with unifying design. Another piece that has been unifying the iPhones and the MacBooks is this notch right here, which I know a lot of people are also talking about. I will let you guys know whether or not it disrupts the workflow after I set up this laptop, but in the meantime, I do not mind whatsoever. You can probably tell that they shrank the bezels a lot, like a fair amount, and because we all know that size matters, the screen size is a lot bigger, and it looks beautiful. I personally am very, very glad that I waited for the MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chips to come out rather than getting the MacBook M1 chip, so the MacBook Airs, or even just the regular MacBook Pro 13 inches. And again, I'll talk about why later. So somebody who has just graduated and is paying off student loans, I purchased the base model. I was looking at the M1 Max chip, but aside from the fact that I cannot afford it, it's also super, super powerful. Like, if you are a student watching this video and you're trying to decide between the M1 Pro or the M1 Max chip, if you're doing regular coursework like taking notes, maybe doing some Adobe Photoshop, perhaps doing some very basic gaming. I'll talk about that in a second. Maybe some programming or even film, video editing like I am myself, then the M1 Pro is very, very good. Like, you do not need an M1 Max chip. But if you are somebody who is doing a lot of video editing, which we all know takes a lot of processing power for computers in general, maybe game a little bit, then the M1 Max probably would be a better laptop for you. But that said, I know a lot of gamers, intense gamers, would not purchase Apple MacBooks whatsoever because there are so many different better gaming laptops. So with that said, that is my first impression. Let's get into the shell. Okay, so what I am not a fan of though is actually the keyboard backing, which I know is so minor, but if you recall the previous MacBook generations, they would always have the backing that was more of a silver color, and I personally found that more sleek. And now it's all black, and it just feels like when I get dust on it, or if I'm eating spark food popcorn, it will accumulate, and you can definitely see it. Obviously, you gotta clean it more, and I just don't know if I have the time for that. Another very popular topic is how they got rid of the touch bar up top, and they actually replaced it this time with full size, not like those half-size ones, but full size function keys, like the ones that you see on the Apple Magic Keyboard. So I personally really like that. Again, I came from the 2015 MacBook Pro line, so therefore we never really had something where it was a touch bar. I never experienced it myself, but I've heard that a lot of people were not a fan of them, especially if they were not designers. I know that you could change colors or something of the sort with the color wheel when you had the touch bar, but for regular users, they often didn't use it, and this just feels a lot better. There's a Touch ID at the top right here. And then let's talk about the shell, okay? So they brought back 5 ports. So 5 ports total, 3 of which are Thunderbolts. Okay, so on this end you're gonna see that there are Thunderbolt 4s, and then you got the MagSafe adapter, the charger. They also brought that back, which is amazing. I'll also talk about the charger in a second, because the wire, from what I hear, is also different from the 2020 version for the charger. So they have the headphone jack here. Port number 3 is the other Thunderbolt, as well as the SD card slot, and then you got the HDMI. Super happy that they brought those back. And what's super cool is that they actually have MacBook Pro engraved at the bottom, so they no longer have the logo at the very bottom of the screen. Let's head on to the next segment. So I'm going to throw a bunch of specs on screen, specifically those that I think are relevant for us students, for the workflow that we normally use. What I would like for this section to help you guys with is to help you narrow down which specs you are looking for, especially if you're trying to decide on which laptop to buy. I'm going to talk about from my personal experience as well as what I've heard and read on the internet. So first things first is the Apple M1 Pro chip. So up until 2020, of the MacBook Pro 13-inch, Apple used the Intel chip, just like their Windows counterparts. They used Intel chips, and a lot of the reasons why Apple changed to an M1 chip is that because you are using, well, you could call them now a competitor chip, it is not optimized for the usage of Apple. So if you're creating a chip that is specifically for your own brand of MacBook Pros or MacBook Airs, whatnot, it will work a lot better and help the computer perform better than something that was from another brand. There are 3 main benefits with the Apple M1 chip. Because it is, again, made for Apple, you have much better performance, so a lot of faster processing speeds. Another piece is the fact that it would use less battery. So there is this whole snippet that Apple was talking about when they were releasing the MacBook Pros about how much less battery the M1 Pro and the M1 Max chips use compared to both the M1, I'm pretty sure, as well as the competitor for PCs. The new battery for the MacBook Pro 14-inch is a square brick like we usually see. I know that the 16-inch actually is a larger brick. It's actually rectangular because obviously it needs more power. The cord in and of itself is actually braided. It is much easier to transport and much more flexible than the prior ones. The third piece was the thermal throttling. So a lot of the problems that MacBooks used to have was heating up. Pretty sure you guys can relate to this, but I still remember my MacBook heating up a lot. And so one of the biggest reasons why this heat up was occurring was because of the Intel chip. And if you guys are looking for something called RAM, It is now no longer part of the Apple line of laptops vocabulary because it has been replaced with unified memory. And basically, if you're trying to decide between the 8 gigabytes of unified memory for the M1 chip versus the 16 or the 32 gigabytes of unified memory for the M1 Pro or the M1 Max chip, then how you can usually decide is how many programs you're going to be running at the same time. So if you are, again, a student and you're just going to take some notes, watch some YouTube videos, maybe do some very basic gaming, then using something like 8 or 16 gigabytes of unified memory would work perfectly well for you. If you are somebody who is doing some video editing, at the same time you're also using some Photoshop and you're running some YouTube videos in the background, then you're probably going to be better set with a 16 or a 32 gigabyte unified memory. Another big difference with the M1 chips is that it now uses the same memory bank basically for the CPU and the GPU. So the difference between the CPU and the GPU is that the CPU, it can complete a bunch of tasks all at once, but it is more or less short term, whereas something like a GPU, it does a lot of rendering. Say that you are using an Excel sheet or you're trying to copy paste a lot of items onto your clipboard many times, what you're doing is using the CPU more often. Or if you're trying to open applications, then you are using the CPU. Whereas if you are video editing or maybe doing some Photoshop design, then you are using GPU heavy programs. So if you're trying to decide between the CPU and the GPU and what level that you want, think about the workflow that you're going to be using, how many programs you're going to run at the same time, what you're going to be doing on those programs, how long you're going to be running them for, and whether or not you want your computer to slow down, and maybe even at what time you want the fan to speed up. A lot of people are wondering if the notch gets in the way of the workflow, especially if you use a lot of the top menu bar items. Most of the time, if you're using like regular programs or if you're browsing the internet, it will not affect it. If you are using something like a design program like Photoshop, it can affect it, but you actually have the option to choose to have the menu bar right under the notch, so it'll basically be the same thing as not having the notch get in your way. So if you're trying to choose between the 13, 14, or the 16-inch MacBook Pros, I'll first talk about the 13 and the 14-inch. There's actually a lot of differences. For the 13-inch, you get less ports, but if you are somebody who really won't use it much aside from web browsing and again like YouTube streaming, then you probably won't need anything more than the 2020 13-inch. But that said, because the 13-inch does have the M1 chip rather than the M1 Pro or Max, it obviously doesn't have as strong of a processing speed. It, like I mentioned, less ports, so if you're tired of bringing a bunch of adapters, then I would probably recommend you looking into the brand new MacBook Pros. And obviously a big pro for some people is the fact that even though you don't have a lot of ports, you do have the touch bar. So I know some people do prefer that and they would probably stick with their 13-inch. Another piece of the 13-inch is that the 2020 MacBook Pro 13-inch is the last MacBook Pro to allow you to choose between either the M1 chip or the Intel chip. And I'll be quite honest, unless you are using some really different software that is not compatible with the M1 chip, most software have been migrated over to the M1 chip, so you could use it also on these M1 chips. I personally would not choose the Intel chip. Again, like I mentioned, because of the whole thermal throttle going on and the fact that it's not made by Apple, therefore it cannot be as optimized performance-wise as the Apple-made M1 chips. If you're thinking between the 14 or the 16-inch, one of the biggest difference really is screen size, because Apple for the first time brought us the ability to spec pretty much the exact same into our 14-inch as that of our 16-inch. So if you do not want such a large screen size for the 16-inch, you can actually add in, for example, the M1 Max chip rather than the M1 Pro chip into the 14-inch. Or if you really are not looking for such a powerful chip, but you are looking for a larger screen size, well then you can add in the M1 Pro into your 16-inch MacBook Pro. And obviously the 16-inch will be a lot faster, and it's great at handling a bunch of programs all at once, depending on which CPU and GPU that you also choose. But most of the time, because it is usually made to fit higher specs, it does run with more capacity. And also with the 16-inch, you get better thermals and better thermal performance. And that's that. I hope this amateur unboxing and the comparisons that I've been studying and all the specs that I've been studying have been able to help you guys narrow down what you need. Please leave a comment down below in terms of what else you want to see for video content, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you do enjoy my content. I do promise to put out more and better content every single time I make these videos for you guys. I will see you in my next video.